This stuff you don't learn at school. This stuff you don't see on your TV. This stuff you don't see in your newspapers. Because the government don't want you to know the truth.
Well, as to all the beautiful brothers and sisters, I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners here. And
I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country where we are. Acknowledge the elders. But them old grey-haired brothers, old warriors that have travelled up from interstate, and our local elders too.
Brisbane is a contemporary Australian city, a multicultural cross-section of citizens intersected by a labyrinth of roads and infrastructure. It's a young, growing city nestled in the state of Queensland, a state steeped in colonial legacy and traditional Australian values. Often chided by its southern counterparts as a bastion of conservative politics, this stereotype belies its rich cultural history. History documents the discovery of Brisbane by Matthew Flinders in 1799, but it wasn't really settled by the colonials until July 1825, when Sir Thomas Brisbane, then Governor of New South Wales, made it a penal colony. Two main tribes inhabited the Brisbane region, the Yagara and Turrumbul, as their ancestors had done for tens of thousands of years. In 1859, an estimated 20,000 Aboriginal people lived in southeast Queensland. The introduction of smallpox, colds and measles, the depletion of food resources, and a scarring history of enslavement and subjugation took a huge toll on the Indigenous population.
The most identifiable and the best flag in the world, the Aboriginal flag. And we have to rally around that flag again. And we have to let the politicians know that they are the ones who are responsible for what is happening in Aboriginal Australia. Not the view coming from Cape York and the professors and the handful of hand-picked people that the Australian newspaper works in conjunction with Jenny Macklin and selects, and the same old faces get put up on the same old committees to advise the white people what should happen to Aboriginal people. Advise? When do we need to advise the white people? We know what we want. Well, let's stand up and say it.
Today, Australia's identity is still stained by its treatment of its native people. The history of Indigenous Australians during early white Australia is marked by years of deprivation and oppression. Unable to vote, secure land rights, and with no entitlement to public representation, their history mirrors that of Indigenous populations across the world.
To this day, the 500 Aboriginal tribal nations, language groups and family networks across the land have never ceded 1 degree of our national sovereignty to the British Crown. This always has been and always will be Aboriginal land one time.
because all the dysfunction, as we all know, is from the impact of colonisation and all the trauma. So what this country's trying to do is reconcile without the truth. Nelson Mandela said that in 1997 when I went to visit him. He said, in my country in South Africa, we're having reconciliation with the truth. In Australia, trying to have reconciliation without the truth.
Indigenous Australia has had a long history of political activism. The first tent embassy was erected in Canberra on the lawn of Old Parliament House in 1972. This embassy, and others like it across the country, signified the persistent fight for Aboriginal rights. The embassies were a focal point for the Aboriginal rights movement, despite the government's refusal to offer any formal recognition. The legitimacy and cultural relevancy of these tent embassies has been debated by members of government, the media, and those still engaged in the protests.
No, the government does not have the right to tell me how to protest and how to do my business. You know, there's not even a legitimate writing in the parliamentary system that says they can tell us how to protest or they can tell us how to live our way of life, because we're not even written into their constitution at the moment. You know, so they're like, so they shouldn't be even saying that if it's not even like written in their own words to put that on us.
We say the law. I mean, most people talk about the white law. There are two laws in Australia, the black law and the white law. The white law has the backing of a powerful political force called the police. It's enforced by a powerful institution called the courts. And the people who make white law are a powerful group of politicians. But that doesn't mean that Aboriginal law is any less legitimate.
There have been many issues protested by the movement over the last 50 years, including the right to vote, the stolen generation, and land rights. Like many political struggles, the public opinions to these issues have changed over time. However, many of the group feel that the same patriarchal attitudes that once governed still pervade public policy to this day. In 2012, Brisbane was catapulted into the forefront of this debate. This documentary is dedicated to the Brisbane Tent Embassy, erected in 1982, and its reappearance 30 years later in March 2012. The city of Brisbane is flanked by 4 main boundary roads. Many of the city's residents are unaware of their historical context. In Brisbane's early years, they were used to mark the racial limits of the city. Aboriginal people were not allowed within these boundary roads after nightfall. Situated in close vicinity to West End's Boundary Street and viewed as a safe haven for Aboriginal people in early settlement, Musgrave Park is cited by many as an important historical meeting ground for local Aboriginal people. In 1982, Musgrave Park was the primary site for one of Queensland's biggest Aboriginal rights protests, with several thousand protesters camping out in the park during the 1982 Commonwealth Games.
This is a democracy. We should be able to march when we like. It's not communist Russia or Poland or any of those places where you can get locked up and all those sorts of things, but you can in this state. And we have... What do we want? 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 What have we got? What have we got? Those people, what do we want? What do we want?
My people, the dawn is breaking. The world is waking to a new bright day, where none defame us, no restriction tame us, nor colour shame us, nor sneer dismay. Now brood no more on the years behind you. The hope assigned you shall the past replace, when a juster justice, grown wise and stronger, points the bone no longer at a darker race.
Come back for it. And I drive it for you. Beyond all reasonable doubt, prior occupancy, prior ownership of this country, land rights is important for the survival of Aboriginal people. Land rights is vital for the survival of Aboriginal people. This society that's around us here today, see all them big buildings and all that stuff, and all through white Australia, is a society that worships money.
Musgrave Park was again chosen as a site for the tent embassy in early 2012. However, within months of its opening, the embassy had already developed staunch opposition from local politicians. This political and cultural powder keg exploded in May 2012 when police stormed the embassy and evicted protesters forcefully.
Police service now intends to remove you from the park.
Lift your arms, relax your arms.
In Queensland courts, it was found that this eviction was unjust, and the Sovereign Embassy was given back its rights to use the park, and the tent embassy was reassembled.
Those coconuts, those jackies, those gatekeepers that are sitting in these organisations, holding the purse strings, holding the money, trying to gag the debate, trying to gag the argument. From who gets locked up, you fellas prove that we don't have to worry about these gatekeepers. Because sooner or later that fence falls down. What we did today was knock that fence over. Walked over the fence. Fuck the gate!
In October 2012, the Musgrave Park Sovereign Embassy celebrated the 30th anniversary of the 1982 Commonwealth Games protest. The protesters followed the original route of the rally through the city. Once again, the struggle for Aboriginal rights in Brisbane took centre stage, and the question was asked, have things really changed?
I remember hearing an Aboriginal rally come up the street. You'd hear that wonderful chant. What do we want? Land rights. When do we want it? Now. What do we got? Fuck all. And that chant resonated through all of the halls of the streets. Land rights.
And they pass in their arms every day to come out of the street, and they will get locked up, they will get beaten black and blue for us. The plan they can tell you what we're all about. So what do we want? Land rights! What do we want it? Land! What do we got it? Fuck all!
Who stole this land? Who owns this land? We do!
We all have to stand up. And we have to get our friends, those in high places, as well as those in universities and in the factories, in the churches, back out on the streets again. It's our job to educate. We're not in there to do reconciliation. That's a white fella problem. He'll work it out one day that it was a white man's dream, but a black man's nightmare.
See on your TV, this stuff you don't see in your newspaper. Because the government don't want you to know the truth of how they suppress, how they rob, how they steal, how they fabricate a country that is based on lies. You talk about Iraq. 30 years ago, your army, your proud soldiers that you're sending over there to die were sent with us with guns to shoot us in this street. 30 years ago. Is that what your army stand for? Is that what you stand for? Is that what that's what your flag stands for? That's what your people stand for. Shame! 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 Shame!
From all different nations. We all come from our nations. This country here, this place that they call Australia, there's 500 different nations. This country here, truly, this country here, we had utopia. We had a perfect place.
The mind boggles at what the hell's going on in one of the wealthiest countries in the world. Our people are 2.5% of the national population. Every statistic that you can talk about, we're quadrupled. And instead of them leaving the primary health care or the preventative programs in place, instead of them implementing the National Aboriginal Health Strategy's recommendation, the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths and Custody, all the social justice stuff, the National Aboriginal Education Policy, all those things that have been talked about from the grassroots level, they're pulling the rug from the needy, taking all that away. They're building more bloody jails.
Dismal failure by all state and federal governments in addressing Aborigines' rights and interests, our needs and our aspirations, and in fact all they've been doing is managing us. They are still managing us. And they'll set up blackfellas inside different types of organisations, inside the departments, and they will call that we are engaging with Aborigines. When have they sat down and talked to you about the Constitution? Anyone here? What do they want to call it? Me and you unity. What does that say? It talks about a simulation, and that's all it is. When you have people getting up and calling themselves and being recognised by governments as national leaders who continue to basically espouse the assimilation policy, then basically they're letting you down. You've got to get up and say, you can't speak on my behalf. You do not have our consent. You can put all the tents up you like and call them sovereignty tents. Good. It's a good way of educating white people and black people. But educate properly. Where sovereignty happens is our own country. On your own country. You've got to go home. You've got to go home with your knowledge and your experience and your expertise. And you've got to sit down with those people and establish their tribal governments and their autonomy to govern and to establish a viable economical base, establish a workforce, training, employment, and revive the culture.